Okay, Paolo, I think we can
start.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is really a great honor for me to introduce some of my friends and these super interesting books. I was reading them this morning, and I think they really complement each other in interesting ways. So first of all, the book of Professor Wampler, Professor McNulty, and Professor Touchton is really a unique systematization of a really massive literature on participatory budgeting. We had before books in which different authors were contributing chapters about different continents or nations, but this is really the first attempt to sort of systematize this really large and a bit chaotic knowledge. And so it's really a unique and gargantuan effort, I think. It's super interesting. I think it will become my new book for really introducing participatory budgeting in its evolution to my students. The book of math, instead, is slightly different. And I think one of the main contribution is that it really has a deep approach that links to philosophy of science and really goes into the complexities of analyzing case studies and one of the few, actually, if not the only one, application of QCA to the analysis of case studies within democratic innovation, and in particular participatory budgeting. So I think this is a great opportunity from hearing from the authors. I'm gonna leave them to start talking about the books. So Matt Ryan, obviously, the people from Southampton know, is a professor at Southampton, and instead Brian is at Boys. Michael, where are you, Michael, now? I forgot. And Stephanie, I don't know. I don't remember where you guys are.
Miami. You can see behind me.
Miami. And Stephanie, where are you?
I'm at Franklin and Marshall College, but right now I'm in South America.
Oh, okay, good. So I'm gonna let actually now the space to actually the great authors, and then I think we follow up with some Q&A.
But we're going to go first to the discussants. So
okay, sorry.
Yeah. So I'll just quickly introduce. So I think Carla, are you happy to go first? And I think you've got a bit of a presentation. So what we're going to do is we're going to have 10-15 minutes each from Carla Bezerra and then from Maggie Shum, who are going to discuss our books, and then we'll try and respond to some of that, and then we'll have a Q&A for everyone to get involved and give their thoughts.
So I'm just sharing my screen, just a second. Okay. So thank you very much for the invitation for debating. Can you hear me? Just like nicely, okay. So I thought like I had like 30 minutes. Is it 15 or 30 minutes? Just so that I can.
We were thinking about 20 each, but
okay, I'll try to fit into 20. So like I think like these two books that we're discussing today, they make very relevant contributions, but although, as Paolo mentioned, in very different ways, and I'll try to highlight how they really complement each other theoretically and empirically. And they also may represent like a new moment in participatory budgeting research. And I think like they represent a very, very important advance on that. And so I will go like the outline of my presentation will go like, okay, sorry. Oops. Okay. So I'll go like for key contributions and unresolved issues for each of the books, and then potential connections for future research. Participatory Budgeting, Global Perspectives from Brian Wampler, Stephanie McNulty, and Michael Touchton aims to review PB's spread and transformation around the world. Just a sec. And with an emphasis on institutional adaptation and how these adaptations produce variation in PB's impact on social and political change, as I quote from the authors. And for that, they build up the state of art of PB research. They do provide a really impressive amount of review of empirical research for worldwide cases of PB. They provide a very broad a new analytical framework, building in a PB typology and a theory of change and how PB produces outcomes both politically and socially. So these are like, it's a really impressive book. I had a really great time reading it, and I had so many ideas and thoughts and things up to discuss, and I'll try to highlight some of them here. Okay. So I think like the main one of the first key contributions is like a clear definition of participatory budgeting that is at the same time broad but specific. Like besides being a program that discusses the budget, the annual budget with citizens, they bring the idea of 5 principles in which each PB case to be considered participatory budgeting and not like some mimic of it. It should adjust to 5 principles in more or less with different intensities, and they will then build on these 5 principles to define different typologies of participatory budgeting. So I did really like the idea. And I think also these 5 principles could fit into other kinds of definition of not only participatory budgeting, but participatory institutions as well. Like we could try to build in that, like to think of other participatory institutions and how do they fit or not into these principles. Another key contribution is the PB as a dynamic institution that is constantly changing, adapting, evolving, and they depend very much on the kind of promoters that promote and then make the adaptations, local adaptations of participatory budgeting. I think like this is one of the highlights of the book, in my opinion. The 3 waves are very interesting, although they have very different time lapses, timing. So one lasts 5 years, the other 10 years, the other 15 years. I was thinking, can we actually like consider these 3 ways? But they do make sense coherently inside. And the types of PB diffusion, the idea that PB, you create an institution, it is after diffused, and when it arrives at a place, it will be adapted during adoption. It's not so obvious, but it's not something that we usually think of, but it's actually pretty much obvious after you put it in paper. So I really like the idea of thinking of different motivations, incentives for different promoters and adopters. And I think this should be developed at some point. This goes, so the different kinds of adaptation go into the PB typology, but I think they should deserve even more further development in so another key contribution is a big systematic this framework of conditioning factors for participatory budgeting outcomes. So I think this kind of like draws on all literature review. So everything that has been developed in previous research on participatory budgeting is kind of like summarized into this, is summed up into these categories. So I think like the macro political context should deserve further development, not only like to consider regimes, but also to consider political systems such as parliamentarism, presidentialism. That's something I developed in my argument, that participatory budgeting is very important in multi-party presidentialist systems, and as a way to bypass legislative. And I think decentralization, economic conditions, also like the separation between macro and meso. And as we will see in the book, Matt's book, does some QCA analysis considering this kind of condition. It's very similar ones, mostly at the meso one, but there is some so I think like his work also could very much benefit from this kind of like broader and systematizing conditioning factors that consider both macro and meso conditions. And finally, we have both I put together, because like in the book they developed first the typology that connects each kind connects to a different each criteria to build the typology connects to the 5 PB principles plus the kind of adaptation, the promoters, and they build up this typology that then is connected to expected social and political outcomes. So it's a really huge framework to make an analysis of participatory budgeting. And just a sec, I have like specific notes here that I wanted to address, and yeah, about it. So what I consider like is that it's a very, very huge effort. However, the typology has some overlapping features, as it's not clear how many different classifications you may have for each criteria and how these different combinations match. So sometimes it's not very clear, so it mixes up, some things may be cause and consequence at the same time. For example, promoters and incentives maybe come out as a consequence for the design or a cause for the design. I think that one interesting way to further develop the typology would be to try to combine promoters, incentives, and conditioning factors as having an outcome as a prevalent type of PB design. So like instead of, and then connect the design with a specific political and social outcome. I don't know if that's clear, but we can, I can further explain that on Q&A. I don't think we have much time. So in sum, like it's a must-read book for anyone who is beginning and who is a long-time scholar in participatory budgeting. It's a very, very good introductory book that provides a very, very overarching approach on the state of art of the study of participatory budgeting. So it was really good. But of course, it brings some unresolved issues. One of the things that is not tackled in the book is the time effect. So how do we consider, so it's kind of written wrong here. So how do we consider PB continuity and discontinuity? So like in my forthcoming article that I use Spada's data set. It's an article that was written a long time ago, and it's finally going to be published about why participatory budgeting declined in Brazil. We can see that there are different reasons for the first time adoption and then for its continuity. So I think like time, it's also hard to compare different cases. For example, we are comparing Porto Alegre case, which you have like 20 years of participatory budgeting with a case that has like 2 years, 3 years. So how do we compare these cases in outcome design? And so I think like this is something that should be deserve some attention in further studies, and the role of promoters in conditioning PB adoption and adaptation. So I think this is tackled and developed in the book, but I think that's like what, as I mentioned, the highlight. And I think like they might condition, my guess is like, once they condition the design, the promoters condition the design and the incentives, they also might condition the outcomes themselves. And this, you can kind of like understand this from the book reading, but it's not exactly how the argument is developed. So is developed in the book. So, and finally, I think like, although you do, the authors do bring like a very, very rich description of cases from Latin America, Africa, Asia, North America, Europe. We still miss a systematic comparison across similar cases. Because like in some cases, we are talking about like nationally mandated thousands of local participatory budgeting, and we're comparing them with another country that has like one single case. So it's not comparable. So I think like connecting now with Matt's book, I think we do need to compare, of course, similar cases, consider differences in government level. So we do have most participatory budgeting are at municipal level, but we do have sub-municipal level, like neighborhood, or also state level, national participatory budgeting. How do we compare these different cases? I don't think they are comparable within them. The resilience, like why do participatory, but why is it adopted, and how does it last? How does it resist time? How does it resist political change? And that's one of my main concerns here in Brazil, as like participatory budgeting is really, really in decline. And how do you compare different designs? So different designs are going to provide different outcomes. We cannot expect that digital participatory budgeting will have a same engagement effect as one that is very, that has like local meetings in neighborhoods. So how do we do systematic comparison across a broad range of cases, but considering the similarities within them? And I think Matt Ryan's book offers a good methodological tool for that. So the book aims, and I quote, to draw a range of cases to explain conditions under which citizen control of budget spending decisions is effectively established. And from that, he understands success as the effective institutionalization of democratic participation. He is not concerned in his book, but he doesn't, he has a narrower scope to understand the democratic effects of participatory budgeting. He's not concerned with other potential social outcomes. And I think like this helps us to like really try to understand precisely the conditions and the criteria to judge and compare the cases. He then reviews previous studies on participatory budgeting, especially Wampler's books, applying QCA to different PB samples using more than one group of criteria. Actually, like I would say mostly two groups of criteria, one for the broader sample that he draws from Latin American cases and European cases. I think there are some from North America as well. And then he uses Wampler's criteria to analyze his own cases, Wampler's cases. So I think like instead of telling us why citizen participation succeeds or fails, his key contribution is actually to show us the relevance, potential, and challenges for QCA analysis using cumulative knowledge for medium and qualitative comparison. So like he does make a point that it is important to compare, and that systematic comparison may show us some of our theoretical inconsistencies, even if it doesn't show us like the answer that we wanted, like what causes what. So even if it's not always effective to show to evidence the causal mechanism. So systematic comparison allows to test and identify inconsistency in theory building. We can see that there are different conditions for like logic. This is drawn from a logical disclosure. So there are different conditions for success and different conditions for total failure. And the conditions for success may vary significantly depending on the standards and conceptualization. So I think here, like the main, the highlight is also like, there's a point that is sort of, that could be further developed in in Ryan's book, is that depending on the conceptualization, on your theoretical framework, on your calibration, you may have completely different results. And what the book shows is that, at least for the criteria that he used in his book, was not enough to answer answer in a very convincing way why participatory budgeting succeeds or fails. But maybe using now a broader framework as provided in Wampler's, Touchton, and McNulty's book, maybe we can jump into a new moment of research. So the unresolved issues are challenges for adequate calibration with potential very different conclusions depending on your conceptual framework, your standards. And also, when we look, his key finding is that political leadership matters. Is a necessary condition for the absence of political leadership is a necessary condition for failure, and it's a insufficient but necessary condition for success of participatory budgeting. However, this criteria, political leadership, it overlaps several dimensions. It has party ideology, party support for participation, government instrumental incentives for citizen participation, as he defines in the beginning. And for most of the text, it actually resounds like mayor or political leader commitment to participation. And this criteria resembles a lot to what in the Brazilian literature about participatory budgeting was called of political will, which has been very criticized for being vague and not really addressing what you really mean with political will. So I think this is one criteria that should be separated, splitted, and better addressed to understand what we're talking about. So what do we have here? So as I've said, these two books make very relevant contributions for the field. One, I would say mostly in its theoretical framework, a very novel approach that it provides and kind of like draws on all the previous development of the literature. And the other with new methodological tools that provide a way to systematically analyze middleman cases, which is perfect for participatory budgeting policies. So how do we connect this broad theoretical framework and this systematic comparison across cases? I think we do have a very fertile field for future research by bringing in the two contributions of these two books. And finally, it still remains unanswered, and QCA, as Matt Ryan states, is not very effective to respond. Also for that is how do we address time effects and a dynamic comparison across time, the effects of long-lasting participatory budgeting, and so on. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer, to clarify any of my comments, and I thank you once again, all the authors for the invitation for the debate.
So thank you so much, and congratulations for publishing the paper. And so now we pass to Dr. Shum, that is the second discussant.
All right. Hello, you hear me well? Good. All right, cool. So, well, thank you very much for the introductions. And before I start, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Brian and Matt for inviting me to participate in this panel. And also want to thank the Center for Democratic Futures for organizing this event, which allows PB scholars like us, practitioners, or maybe anyone who's interested in democratic innovation to share our thoughts, lessons with one another. So, let's see. So I will start. I think I will start with Matt Ryan's book. But before I go, I will just kind of give an overview of what I'm going to cover. So I think both Matt's book and Brian, Stephanie, and Mike's book perform great service to the field of PB. So as Paolo mentioned at the beginning, the literature is fast and sometimes chaotic. So I think the authors are organizing the literature in very different systematic ways. So for me, it's almost thinking about like, you ended up in a room full of toys, but sometimes you need to organize the stuffed animals on one side, or the cars and toys on the other side, or by colors, right? So I think it's a very interesting exercise when you put these two books together to see how different authors or how different scholars think about PB, conceptualize PB in different ways. So given the time limits here, what I really want to do is to highlight some of the contribution these two books put forth, and also how these two books complement and speak to each other. And in the end, offer some of my thoughts in terms of the future direction of PB research, which I think these two books did a very great job in terms of laying like a path and direction for future scholars and practitioners who are interested in democratic deepening in PB, those type of research that can help drive this agenda. So both books take a deep dive into the PB literature, but with a slightly different angle. So for Matt's book is that after the deep dive, like go deep into the sea of PB, and when he comes up, it's like on one hand you have a long list of conditions that are deemed essential for democratic deepening, but on the other hand, what he has is also a long list of possible outcomes that those conditions explain. And what they see in the middle is all this, ties and fuzzy and complex connection between them. So I think so in a crux for this inquiry for Ryan is that he's less concerned about the probability, how, whether like deepening democracy occur. Rather, his main goal is to navigate this causal complexity, especially in explaining how PP programs outcome varies across cases, or how sometimes different conditions actually produce a similar outcome, what he called an equifinality. And so one of the major, the unique contribution of Matt's book is his methodological approach. I think for me, this book is, it reminds me of Michael Koppich's book about method and studying democratization. So it's like this, Matt Ryan's book basically is that it studied the PB, but then at the same time, it's like he offered you a master class in how to leverage QCA, the qualitative comparative analysis, and a fuzzy set QCA in examining which conditions are necessary or sufficient for the outcome of interest, which is the citizen control of collective decision in PB with his selection of cases. So building on the rich set of small cases, Matt is tapping on the traditional strength of PB literature, which are case-based knowledge, in building his medium and case study. So especially in the way how he demonstrates the calibration of the different sets, in which he draws on rich description in existing casework, and also his deep understanding of conceptual clarity that allows him to categorize the different cases into different sets or into the different sets. So I'm not going to summarize the book too much, since Carla did a very good job in terms of giving a lot of detailed information. So I'll just kind of quickly breeze through this. So Matt meticulously walk us through the concept and logic of QCA, and then patiently, really patiently demonstrating the technique of the QCA. In the end, I think what is great what he did was that he had a side-by-side comparison with Brian Wampler's seminal 8K study of PB in Brazil, along with Matt's his own 31 case QCA model to illustrate the usefulness and complementary nature of QCA, that it can provide very nuanced yet parsimonious theory. So and then I want to highlight some of the finding from Matt's book, is that like the four condition he focuses on are really, we can find those in a lot of PB studies. Of course, some highlighting, political will or leadership, or some other highlighting civil society. But with the QCA method is that it allows him to draw a very strong and distinctive causal connection between all these variables. For example, what he finds is that political leadership, or kind of like the concept of political will, is a necessary condition for citizens to gain meaningful control of collective action, but on its own it's not sufficient. Yet other factors such as civil society, bureaucratic support, and financial capacity on their own, they are not necessary. But when he interact those type of variables together, they actually can produce a sufficient condition for success. So some of the highlight will be, if we have a vibrant and autonomous civil society alongside with capacity, a strong and supportive bureaucracy, it is actually sufficient for success, even though despite the financial challenges. And some other kind of interaction between a variable, what he found is that political will alongside with strong financial position, or political will alongside with strong bureaucracy buy-in, is also sufficient for empowered democratic decision making. And I think it's very important because as scholar and consumer of PB literature, we are always seeing all these different different studies drawing different conclusions. So in the end, it seems everything is necessary. But I think what Matt does here is really showcasing those kind of combination using the Boolean logic, and then to show us that it's not that, oh, if you don't have all these four conditions, you're doomed. There are ways that can work through. And I think in a way, it gives hope for also practitioner to really think about that. Oh, okay, if I don't have support from the political leadership, but at the same time, it is also other ways that PB can happen and be successful. And I think this is a very, at least kind of like a positive a very positive message that come out from his study, is that there are always ways to promote democratic deepening. And then and I think the other point that I want to point out in Ryan's book is actually his penultimate chapter, talking about kind of like the failed cases. And I think he's right in pointing out that we always ended up study successful cases because I will want to learn what are the criteria conditions that lead to successful cases. But sometimes we actually don't have enough kind of like theoretical tools or thought to understand why some case fail, especially some of the unsolved cases. It's like if political leadership is it's a necessary condition, but how come you do have places where you have good support from the leader, but still have not producing a PB that can that give citizens the power, right? I think that I will talk about this a bit more in terms of future research, but I do think this is a good beginning, in terms of thinking about also trying to explain why cases failed. And perhaps we can also not only learning from successful cases, but also learning from mistakes that we can avoid them, or at least be cautious about, what will lead to a good quality of PB. And with that, I will stop here and then go on to switch gear to talk about Brian, Stephanie, and Mike's book. So their books, on the other hand, take us on a different journey in navigating the PB landscape. So while Matt's goal is to consolidate PB studies into parsimonious yet nuanced theory, I think Brian and his co-author aim to showcase the variety of PB program across different regions of the world under one single theoretical framework. So for Brian, Stephanie, and Mike, they emphasize in their books is that PB is not a static institution, and as PB diffuses across the globe, the program evolves and actually takes on different features to better align with local needs and also depending on the capacity of the different government in different locations. So rather than conceptualizing the outcome variable in terms of success and failed PB program, so Brian and his co-author are interested in the different types of PB cases. I mean, after all, I think one of the main messages from the research endeavor is that institutions matter, in that like different rules and institution design shape the type of PB programs, and in turns how the different types of PB programs will produce different levels and degrees of social and political change. And of course, conceptualizing PB is no easy task. So, the first two chapters, typology and then the theory of change, it reminds me when I pick up, a long time ago, pick up a biology textbook, we talk about classification, right? How you classify different creatures, different animals or plants. And then also, the theory of change reminds me of this cyclical nature of ecosystem, how all the micro, meso, and macro level really kind of contribute and producing a cycle, a vicious cycle or a virtuous cycle, right? So I think that's definitely kind of like one of the main contribution from the book, and it's gonna change or it's going to change the way how PB scholars try to interact and study PB in the future. So the authors conceptualize PB with a set of core principles. So it's voice, vote, social inclusion, social justice, and oversight, which helps set the parameters. So it helps us to weed out cases that may call themselves PB, but in fact are not PB. So this is actually interesting because I think that's too often scholar, including myself, we take PB as granted. It was, of course, that's PB because that's what they call themselves. But then I think this sort of theoretical yardstick really helped us in terms of, okay, those are the cases, the large cases that I want to study. And it's important in a sense that because PB is one of those mechanism or one of the innovation within the participatory institution and also within democratic innovation. And sometimes scholars from different that study different type of participatory institution we communicate, but again sometimes it's at least for us it's good to have a boundary so that we can do our comparison, our comparison analysis in a more coherent way, and then hopefully maybe in the future that we can actually using this type of yardstick, this concept and core principle to communicate with broader literature on participatory institution or democratic innovation. So basically now it's like we're trying not to compare apple with orange. Hopefully we'll end up comparing, say, Honeycrisp apple with Gala apple. So that thing will make more sense. Whatever apple you like, Fuji or whatever that floats your boat. So after they have this core principles, so what then Brian and his co-author then operationalize those principles with 5 factors that motivate PB adoptions. So they are like whether the level of participant engagement, the internal decision-making process, how resources are allocated, the degree of local control, and the kind of the driver that is the actors that's driving adoption, kind of like the diffusion. What are the kind of mode of diffusion, whether it's driven by normative because they're committed to this radicalized democracy, or mimetic, or by coercive. And so based on this various motivation and different adherence to PB's core principle, the author really skillfully typologized PB's institutional design into theoretically meaningful categories. So they come up with the 6 different types of PB. And then so that is kind of like, already one big endeavor, but I said, no, it's not enough. So, and the other jewel in the book is that the author's conceptual model of theory of change, as I mentioned, kind of the idea of, studying all this, the ecosystem, how different level interact with each other. So with this theory of change, what they wanted to try to tackle is kind of like what type of change or outcome is associated with different types of PB program, and also how do macro level and meso level factor condition whether or not PB can generate political and social and political change. And then So in a way that I think kind of like, that is something that the overlap with Matt spoke, is that, again, what Carla also pointed out is that Matt's the four conditions, the kind of political leadership, civil society, bureaucratic support, and financial capacity, is really rested in the meso level, and in terms of Brian and co-authors framework. And what they add in terms of like the macro level of, for example, what they're looking at is the political system, the economic system, or whether this government centralization and whatnot. So I think this is in a way I'll say, so in a way that is, it really gives the context, right? So in Matt's book, we have a very clear conceptual, undertaking of, the theory, but what the bigger concept of Brian co-author was really giving us the context, right? How these structural factors will, at a wider level, can constrain or actually can enhance the PB, different type of PB program. And then, so together, the typology and the theory of change model actually enables us to discern some crucial patterns that it was hard for us to see before. So it's almost giving us a bird's eye view. So in the end, what is interesting is that they find out PB types, the different types of PB program, are clustered by global regions. So we tend to find, for example, more, PB programs that stress on efficient governance in, for example, in Asia, or we tend to find more radicalized deepening democracy type of PB in Latin America. So I think this is an important thing. Again, kind of going back, how context matter, is that, how those different country or a different region really constrained by perhaps a wider political atmosphere, and in terms of the way how they they decide to deal with, like whether to share power with people, or rather that they just want to have more improved well-being and whatnot. So I think that was itself is very useful. And the other thing is that I think it, again, thinking about comparing different types of apple, I think with this framework, we can actually identify cases across region that are similar, right? So for example, what they find is that in the national mandate program, so for Stephanie McNulty studied the case in Peru, but at the same time, we realized that in Indonesia and the Philippines, they also have this kind of a similar way of, like kind of national mandate program. So I think this is a good way, for example, like scholar like Matt, that they want to select cases. For example, I want to select particular cases to compare. And I think those are very good, kind of like a map for you to pick out, or what are the cases that I can meaningfully compare with. Or for example, even if we want to compare different type of PB program, we do have a good yardstick of like what type of, for example, institution design, or what type of like, kind of different driver of diffusion that maybe we can also try to see kind of maybe tackle this equifinality problem, where you have a different condition that leads to a similar outcome. And let's see. So in the end, I think I'm going to quickly wrap up in terms of thinking about a new research agenda. And I agree with both Paolo and Carla that, both books bring us to the cusp of a renewed PB research agenda. I see, as you see from two books, that we saw the methodological diversity that like PB can be studied, like not only with, the rich case study, which itself it's very crucial, because as Matt's mid-size and studies showed us, a lot of things really depends on those rich case studies. But at the same time, we also see, a broader, what Brian and his co-authors showed us is that, all this plethora of different type of large N study, the way how we compare, and so I think it's a good, it's a hopeful note for scholar in terms of leveraging different type of research method in terms of tackling the same problem. And then second is that, as I mentioned before, the study of decline, I think I really want to echo Carla and Ryan's note about failed cases. because, as we see in Brazil and in maybe to some extent Latin America, you see a decline of PB. So some people, they are not interested in implementing it, or some you just have like massive abandonment of the cases. So that really ties into in terms of timing, right? Because interesting is that what makes PB successful, it does not necessarily mirror the failure of PB or decline of PB. So what is the extra other elements that can explain why some PB, like even after a long time, the decline or got dropped, or I think that's definitely a lot of room for future research. And as for what Brian and his co-authors spoke really put out, it's like, I think they give us a map, but they leave us with a lot of questions, a lot of hypotheses to be tested. I think Carla was pointing out that some of the factors, they can be on the independent variable side and also on the dependent variable side. And I think this is for us, like scholar, is like to future side to test the hypothesis to Carla, figure out whether sort of like is it kind of the theory to really to test the theory. And then I think lastly is about and also in Brian's book they talked about a little bit about regime. So they mentioned that they're not taking into account the cases of China and Russia, but at the same time I feel that this may be interesting in terms of thinking about, because now in nowadays we have democratic backsliding or autocratizing. So what does it mean for those kind of country like hybrid regime or autocratic regime to adopt PB? So is it really a veneer for them to gain their legitimacy and while suppressing the people's will, or is that actually some hopes, like glimpse of hopes that perhaps at the local level that people may be able to exercise democracy, exercise voice, and perhaps whether this will lead to bigger impact, right? So I think I've used up all of my time. I will stop here, but I'm happy to engage more in the Q&A session. And again, thank you very much for allowing me to share my thoughts. So I'll give the floor back to Paolo.
Thank you so much to Dr. Bezerra and Dr. Shum for their critical analysis of the two books and the comparison. We don't have a lot of time. I want to pass back the microphone to Brian, Stephanie, and Michael to a first response, and then to Matt. Maybe if we can keep like 5 minutes each, so that we can reserve at least 20-30 minutes for the audience to ask questions. Okay, so.
Great, thanks, Paolo. So I'll try to be fairly brief. Thanks to Carla and Maggie for the great set of comments. That was really helpful to think about bringing everything together. And I also want to congratulate Matt for his book, because I think it is. I think both Maggie and Carla highlighted this really nice systematic comparison of PB cases, and it's the most systematic that we really we have to date. The roots of our book really came when the Hewlett Foundation was interested in sort of investing in the field, and they wanted a state of the art of the field. So that's sort of what started off as sort of a summertime project became a 2 or 3 year endeavor. And we were really surprised, I think, at the breadth of programs that were being implemented across the world. And what we could really see, and this is just the one thing I want to highlight, one of the things I want to highlight is in the current context, we can really see lots of cases of the technical tools that are oftentimes associated with some of the coercive adoption. And those technical tool programs really exist, and they exist in a way that doesn't necessarily allow for some of the democratic impulses to flourish. And we clearly see examples of that. But at the same time, we also see lots of examples of democratic experimentation still going on, that it's the set of principles, and then local governments are adapting rules and changing rules. And I think one of the hard parts of our field, I think right now, is to be able to sort of systematically think about which of these is contributing to citizen empowerment and deepening of democratic experiments, and which are sort of being used to prop up or sort of provide a sense of legitimacy for authoritarian governments or democratic backsliding. I think that's one of the real sort of uncertainties that we had. We introduced that in the conclusion of the book. We don't do research, or we didn't cover a lot of research that's in authoritarian countries, but I think that's one of the key areas for this field to really think about. The last thing that I want to highlight before I turn it over to Stephanie is that I think the theory of change, what we're doing, is a process of trying to sort of start building the causal mechanisms to illustrate how change can take place. I think we have a lot of really good outcome data. We have a lot of good process data, but this was our attempt and our effort to sort of try to think through on a step-by-step basis for how the different types of rules, the different types of political will or political interest may produce variation in process and deliberation and other types of outcomes. I mean, one of the outcomes could sort of be more information, more engaged citizens. But the theory of change, I sort of think about it as sort of trying to sort of be more systematic about a labeling or sort of identifying those categories. I think Matt does that really well with some of sort of bigger picture, and that may be one of the frontiers for future research, is to do it on a more granular level to try to figure out what is it about forms of deliberation. I know Paolo's worked on that for a long time, or what is it about different investment of resources that may lead to outcomes. So I think that's another potential frontier for research. And let me turn it over to Stephanie.
Thanks, Brian. So I also want to keep this short because we really do want to hear people's questions and comments and reactions to the book. But when thinking about both of the comments, I'm thinking in Spanish right now, both of our discussants, mentioned the importance of the typology that we develop and how helpful that is, which is really great to hear, because that was one of the things that we worked on really carefully to try to link the types and the potential for outcomes in terms of hypothesis generation. So I'm glad that struck both of our discussants as important. I would like to say a few things now, looking back, about the types and how we develop them. First of all, I really like Carla's suggestion to link the motivations, the typology, and the outcomes a little bit more systematically. And I think that can easily be a venue for future research. And I've been thinking a lot about the fact that, first of all, we say that PB is not static, right? So all of these types in the past couple of years have actually changed in some ways. And building on what Brian said, I think it changed the shifts towards social accountability and social development models and mandated PB types definitely is important to think about in the sense of democratic backsliding and this COVID pandemic, because right now we see a lot more digital than we did when the book was written, right? So we're going to see, and how does that affect actual participation, inclusion, the potential for democratic outcomes, right? That's something that Paolo has written a lot about, but it's something that we really need to start to address carefully. The other thing is, if you think about the kinds of PB types that are starting to emerge more, they are mostly about efficiencies, transparency, and accountability or public services, but not going to emphasize exactly what Brian mentioned, which is a lot of, the whole PB project originally started as a radical democratic project, right? So I do think the PB scholarly and activist community really needs to think carefully about where PB is headed in terms of, we can talk about them in these types, but also how COVID is affecting the ability of people to participate in these kinds of events. So Mike, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you. And thank you to our discussants and our hosts today. This is a tremendous event. We really appreciate it. In an effort to leave some time for question and answer, I'll also try to be brief. One thing that we've done, we think, somewhat successfully in terms of making a contribution, is identifying these PB typologies that Stephanie just described and that our discussants commented on. Those end up serving, I hope, as a set of hypotheses for future research and for the broader community of PB scholars and non-PB scholars, as well as practitioners, to go out and test, to go evaluate. We have a lot of information about PB in a very, very small set of countries during a specific time frame, most notably Brazil, and Brazil in the 1990s, 2000s, and a little bit into the 2010s. Even then, we only know about PB related to a few sets of outcomes. And while we've developed a nice theory of change, I think, it is still incumbent on the PB community to continue theorizing what PB is supposed to do, what it hopes to achieve, and to divide conceptually the inputs, the mechanisms, the outcomes, the processes, which are difficult for people to articulate in many cases. And there's a lot of confusion about what is inherent to PB as a program versus an outcome that it's supposed to achieve. And hence rigorous testing and evaluation of those programs and subsequent revision of those programs to improve the outcomes that we want to improve is difficult to achieve as well. And so that's a big task. As Maggie talked about, we want to compare apples to apples, and having some shared baseline for categorization and then evaluation is tremendously helpful. But I think we're going to find, as this research agenda expands across individuals and across regions over time, that some of what we thought might be inherent to PB is not. Some outcomes that we had associated only with PB can come from other directions, and some outcomes that we did not anticipate coming from PB do in fact come from PB. But being clear and rigorous about our evaluations and then tempering our expectations, I think, is important. We're likely to see very different outcomes under very different circumstances. And the idea that PB is not a magic bullet that will cure all of society's ills is important to recommend and remember when we're talking to governments and talking to policymakers as well as advocates. Finally, when we see things happen over time in some countries, it gives us a lot of optimism that it can happen the same way in others. And I just want to caution that this is a proposition that needs testing, not a guarantee for what PB will do. We have PB adopted relatively recently in most parts of the world, and change will not be immediate. The change that we'd like to see, if it emerges, will take some time, and this is sensible. So we should also keep those expectations tempered as we move forward to test these propositions that we've developed. Okay, I'll pass this back to Matt, I think, now, and we can move on with the next stage.
Okay, thanks so much, everyone. It's yeah, I mean, so much to say, and I won't say it all, so I'll just make a couple of remarks and then we'll get to hear from the audience, which is what we really want. So, well, a couple of quick things. I think, first of all, thanks so much to the discussants. It's such a privilege to hear a good treatment of your book from two really careful readers that have so much intelligent things to say about them. And I fully agree with everything that you've said. I think to pick, well, the first thing I want to say actually after that is that it was lovely. These two books came out on the same day, and it was one of those things where, you know, when someone asks for directions and you say, I wouldn't have started from here. If I'd have had the book in my hand before I started doing my work, I'd have probably conceptualized everything quite a lot differently, because I remember the first time I saw your theory of change diagram, and there's a nice little diagram, and you've really sorted out, like, I think both of us approached the world of PB, which was very distributed, and we had this problem that we wanted to try and put some order on it, and we did it in very different ways, but I think very useful ways for each of us to think about. So definitely picking up on what Carla said, one of the things I would love to do is go back and look at some of those concepts that Brian, Stephanie, and Mike picked out really well, and see if there is the evidence there to make some of that kind of systematic comparison within the cases, like I think was suggested. by Maggie, I could, narrow down to other cases. So that's definitely a future. And the other thing that you picked up really well, Carla, was one of the weaknesses, or one of the things I couldn't do was I had to really abstract certain conditions. So like the political will condition is quite complex, and it would have been really nice if I was able to get more accurate description or more accurate data that could allow me to drill down to that level, that next level. So I think the real challenge for us going forward, and this was a point I wanted to make in the book, is that we need to be really clear. And I think I tried to make this clear in the way that I operationalize concepts, that we need to have a better kind of common language and standards for what it is that we're describing and what it is that we're measuring when we do these things. I think we're getting there, but this is part of what I wanted to do, was try and show that there are opportunities for doing that if we kind of keep working together on it. The other thing that I thought that came out really, really interestingly was the idea of looking at failed cases. And I think one of the reviewers of the book made an interesting point, which was to ask me, well, you're looking at successful cases and failed cases, but what about middling cases? And I think that that really resonated with me. And when I went back and rewrote things, it really showed, and Carla picked this up as well, that it's not just failures. There's a kind of uncertainty about a lot of what we know about what we don't know about PB. What I kind of wanted to say was we need to be able to articulate that uncertainty. And I kind of Mike just picked up on this as well, really, that we need to be, there are things that we won't know, and a lot of people talk about the long-term conditions. I think that's a real black box for us for obvious reasons, although some of these things happened 30 years ago now that we're talking about. But I think, one of the things that we really need to do is, when I'm sure many of the people on this call are either practitioners or they speak to politicians about implementing PB on a regular basis. And Stephanie picked up on this as well. As soon as you start talking about the more radical democratic aspects these days, that's when you start to find, Paolo will be nodding his head now because he does this. That's when you start to come up with problems, but you come up with ingenious solutions to try and convince people that radical democracy isn't all that bad. Radical doesn't mean bad. It's actually okay. Sometimes it's good. But I think that's one of the things that would help. I'm convinced of this, is if you can be clear where things fail, where the uncertainty is about what we do and don't know, that helps you persuade and convince policymakers to do more radical things, because they at least know what the risk is. And I think that's really what I wanted to do through systematic comparison. So those were really great comments, and I'm going to have to think about a few of them a bit more. But I think we should open it up now, Paolo. So I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much. You can post your question in the chat. Or you can raise your hand. I am in the full view, and I hope to catch everybody raising their hands, so it's up to you. And then I'll give, okay, so I think Silk is the first person that I saw. So why don't we start with your question?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm also happy to rate with my, it's actually a comment, but I hope that is also, so this whole discussion was so fabulous, and congratulations to the authors and to the discussants. What I was thinking of while I was listening was, within social movement studies, there are these debates about co-optation, and also about insider and outsider activism. And so I was trying to think about how I could connect your examinations of participatory democracy. On the one hand, is that a form of co-optation? But also, on the other hand, to what extent does it open opportunities for civil society organizations, and basically makes the connection between insider and outsider activists? And so I was wondering to what extent you are drawing on discussions about NGOization, because there is all this criticism of NGOs selling out. Yeah, while at the same time, they have access to resources and access to processes. And perhaps that would be an interesting way of developing the ideas that you have just discussed further. So apologies that it's not a question, but I hope that is useful.
I saw Stephanie nodding. So do you want to respond to the comment quickly?
I'd be happy to. I just wanted to say that's a super interesting way of looking at PB, and I loved the way you put it. We see so much co-optation in PB, and obviously it depends, it varies. There's so many different kinds of PB programs, but I personally have experienced observing and researching so many PB processes that have been co-opted. So, and I think when you personally, not speaking for the authors, but when you look at it as a technocratic tool, it's almost born from the idea of co-optation. So that might be something for you to think about as you're doing your work, but it's, you know, people, I mostly focus on Peruvian processes, and the birth of it is almost a way of channeling demands through this sort of very safe, you know, sort of peaceful, nonviolent mechanism that becomes very technocratic. So I think it's a really interesting comment, and I really appreciate the way you're looking at it.
Yeah, if I could just jump in too, I mean, it's a great question. Another way to think about it is we think about a lot of community leaders, they're pragmatic local leaders trying to secure resources for their community. But in some ways, PB puts in, the downside is that PB puts an extra burden on them to become oftentimes technical policymakers. So like somebody living in a middle-class neighborhood doesn't need to go to these meetings because the community, the state works for them. But a community leader in a poor community, she has to learn about budgets and how to get things built, and it's an added burden. But I think the tension there is that it also is sort of when the programs, and this goes back to sort of success and failure, when they create opportunities, there's this empowering there's this empowerment that takes place that allows these leaders to then carry that information into other spheres. So they may have the technical knowledge, but then it sort of expands out. And that's sort of trying to figure out is like, to what point is it limited to the one sphere, the one venue, and to what point can it sort of have a sort of a springboard effect so they can affect politics elsewhere? Some of my research elsewhere showed that like the city of Belo Horizonte was only about a third of the leaders who were doing that. That's still a third of the people who are active elsewhere. So that's sort of thinking about sort of springboarding.
Okay, thank you, Brian, for the response. I don't see any other question at the moment. Anybody who wants to ask something?
I can say something about co-optation while people are stopping being shy. So the one thing I wanted to think about there, I just wanted to highlight something that I thought was really nice about the other book, which I think picks up a little bit on what you were saying, Silke, in my mind anyway, which is that I really like that you started the book with some vignettes, but they were particularly vignettes I like about PB, which was showing that okay, people might not have, they deliberated, but then what they did was they got involved in political bargaining, but in a way in which they were willing to give up their own immediate gains or their own future gains in order to allow their projects to be built. So there were a couple of examples of this at the start of the book where some groups within society were willing to bargain with others, for example, not to vote for their projects this year and vote for other projects the next year. I think that's kind of shows like that's far from co-optation, right? So co-optation is not that, and I think that that's what people don't normally get involved with. So while there are obvious examples of lots of co-optation within PB, I think it's important to remember that there is real kind of democratic deepening and real kind of autonomy in what people are doing and the collective decisions that people are making that occurs within these venues that probably would not be occurring without them. So
can I just quickly respond that I think that this ambivalence and this tension is what makes this so exciting, so that it could be co-optation and could be empowerment. It's really both, and there it's so great to have all these rich case studies.
I'm going to use my privilege as a chair to ask a question to Brian, Mike, and Stephanie. So the sort of current understanding of the evolution of participatory budgeting is that we lost something, right? There was almost this golden age about social justice that we lost. Your typology instead, it's more in a sense horizontal, like you still put social justice at the moment as a characteristic of possible participatory budgeting. Is this aspirational? And you have seen case studies in which social justice is still at the center right now around the world, or it's not, and you think there was a stage about social justice that we lost in the diffusion?
Should I go? I mean, there are definitely still cases, Paolo, of programs that embed social justice ideas in them. And I think they're often directly inspired or directly sort of replicating the Brazilian model, right? So you definitely see that more in, like, for example, New York City cases, right? Examples. But what's interesting, one of our interesting findings is that the move from social justice is now the emphasis is social inclusion. I see Selena's on the call, and she works on this issue, and she might want to jump in and see what she has to say about. I'd love to know the reactions of that kind of finding, because it also sort of reflects the 21st century narrative of social justice, the way we've all sort of identity politics and social inclusion. So it may be the logical adaptation if you think about the way our political culture has evolved. So I don't see it as a problem theoretically. I guess my big concern I just mentioned earlier is the way that even that goal might be in decline with the past few years, the way the political and social and cultural changes that we've seen around the world.
Thank you very much. We have a question in the chat from Gilles. Do you want to read it? Or do you want to speak up, Gilles? Or do you want...
Yes, I can talk. Do you hear me? Okay, good. Hello, everyone. So I was wondering, I'm sorry, by the way, I'm outside, so I hope the sound quality is not that bad. I was wondering about the possible bias in both studies. I think that Matt has already, well, actually you, Paolo, and Matt as well, published a very interesting piece about the possible bias about best case studies. Maggie referred to that study earlier on. And I was wondering about those two books, about the potential cases that were overlooked. And one thing that, for example, in Brazil is always puzzled me is the fact that rural towns are not very well known. So we don't know much about the quality of those processes because we assume that they don't have the financial or the administrative capacity to run a PB program. So do we know about other potential biases that we could try to correct in the coming years?
Should I try and take that?
Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, so just quickly, thanks, Sheila. It's a really good question. And I think that I want to speak to both things you asked. So the first thing on potential biases, 100%. I mean, obviously, as social scientists, we know that like the whole point is to try and understand our own biases and correct for them. And we have some tools for doing that. And I think one of the things I wanted to do in the book, and I think that the development of theory in the other book and linking it to the really big, much bigger spectrum of cases than I looked at in the other book is that we get this kind of better sense of where those biases might be and where we're lacking. So I think that was what I wanted to show. And the one nice thing that we have is that they're transparent, right? So I think that was the key thing for me, was to have a kind of a transparent approach. And I was really, I mean, I started doing this work 15 years ago, probably, or something like that, maybe not 13 years ago. And when I was starting my PhD, and like the way that the software has developed since then, it's much more possible for us to potentially develop qualitative work and have a robustness of qualitative work where we can investigate what each other are doing and be able to actually think about accumulating research. So that's something that I think is quite exciting, and that we could potentially use quite well with novel methods as they come on stream. And the second thing, to just talk about the rural towns, I think that's really important. The one thing I could show in my work, which is relevant to that, which I didn't have any rural towns, but at least what I did show was that the assumptions we might have about the variability of financial resources or resource poorness are not necessarily obvious, right? So it's not necessarily a fait accompli that if you're resource poor in terms of the finances available, even in the small amount of variability that was in my study, that will then explain good or bad outcomes. So that does suggest that there are probably very good rural cases and there are probably very bad rural cases. I mean, it's an open question, but that would suggest at least that work has to be done. So I think really good point.
Yeah, if I could just build on that, something that sort of what Matt just said, and then sort of building on what Carla and Maggie said, sort of, I mean, these two books approach sort of comparative analysis differently, but maybe one of the next steps is to come up with sort of better criteria for case selection for future studies, because I suspect a lot of studies are sort of probably in university towns or closer to university towns, you know, master's students or PhD students, and they're probably in more urban areas. And they're probably like, you know, sort of that whole problem in Brazil, people study towns on the coast because population also tend to be more interesting places to live. But small towns, you know, so I think that's one real big frontier. I think another real big bias, which I think we need to sort of think through, is PB is a democratic, or started as a democratic institution. Is it still a democratic institution? Should our expectations for how it functions in China and Russia be the same, or should it be different? And that's one of the real criteria that sort of getting into this sort of one of the future research points is sort of, is it a veneer or is it actually citizen empowerment? And I think that's for me, that's one of the biggest open question in this field, as well as in sort of backsliding. Can PB help prevent backsliding, a democratic backsliding? And to me, that's an unknown. Just to sort of, as a side note, like 10 years ago, I was looking at PB in sort of the Philippines, Brazil, a little bit in Mozambique. And since then, all three countries have suffered from intense backsliding. And some of the people I engaged with there were saying, well, we should have invested in building party systems and campaign finance. So that's sort of this question that we need to sort of, the parallel issue is, are there other types of institutions in parallel that we should be looking at that could, you know, help to strengthen empowerment or strengthen democratic processes better than or in a similar fashion to PB? And I actually have a question for Matt, if I can jump in. So Matt, one of your key findings, as sort of I interpret your book, was that government leadership was much more important than civil society, configuration and activity. A lot of people come into PB with a civil society lens, and sort of you come in with civil society and participation, but it turns out that the state and government are really important. So what do you think the implication of your findings are, where state and government seem to matter more than configuration of civil society for these outcomes?
It's a great question. I think so. There's two ways to answer that. So one is that the key. So that was one of the key. I think that's one of the things that I brought out. That's probably not in a lot of other work on PB, because it's kind of taken for granted. Because the early ethnographies were very clear that civil society was a key condition that explained that, and they're very clear. And you know, there's no doubting that it was in those cases. It's very clear. But when you compare across, logically across cases, you find that it doesn't seem to explain. Civil society's vibrancy just seems to vary around the piece around success and failure. So that's what I found. But I think there's something going on there. So the reason I said there's two ways to answer that is one, that I think in the context of PEB, civil society and its activity is possibly even less well conceptualized than political will, which Carla picked up on earlier. So you could have done the same thing with civil society that you did to political will. So for example, I think one of the nice things that QCA does is you get these different typologies in an empirical fashion rather than a theoretical fashion. And one of the things it showed me is that there were obviously these cases that had very strong political leadership and strong bureaucratic buy-in, that were those kind of cases that built civil society through the PB. So some of the cases that, particularly ones in this kind of medium-sized city in Brazil that were outside of the larger cities, they were, you know, they weren't going to have the vibrant civil society, but they could build it up because they were kind of hub towns. And that seemed to be one potential explanation, although it's not deterministic or anything like that. It just seemed to go with what we were doing. And then you had these other cases where civil society was completely absent, not completely absent, but at least not as big a part of the story. And those seem to be the bigger cities where you had a lot of money and people were getting involved. So that was kind of what came out from me. But what I think was important, and this is the last thing I'd say, is that it depends on your conceptualization of what deep democracy is. And that was the point I really wanted to make in the book. So if you think, and a lot of us do, if you're very idealistic and you're talking about the real utopias, then civil society is a very necessary condition. You're only going to get those outcomes when you have civil society, the political leadership, and the bureaucratic actors all working in tandem. But that's also a very hard bar to achieve. And it comes back to these expectations that you were talking about. If you set your expectations there, you're not going to get that in Russia. It's maybe, but it's a much more difficult thing to achieve in places where you don't have the same resource. So what I wanted to show was that you might get a different kind of PB when you're not targeting this very ideal outcome, but it might still actually improve democracy a little bit. But I think the bottom line is that the conceptualization of how we think about civil society and what it is, whether it's something that can be built up through the PB or it's something very much in the social movement, that countervailing power to the state, which is kind of the original way I would think about it, what that means. And that tension, I think Silke was pointing to this earlier, is not really well specified. So that would be my answer to your question for now, but I think it's only a partial answer. And Carla, you wanted to jump in at some stage there, it looked like.
Yeah, but I think I can connect Jill's question with what Matt just said. So I think one of the things that might bias our research is our normative expectations. I was just going to talk about it. So I think for example, in Brazil, where we kind of we switched, in the first wave of democratic innovations, we had mostly participatory budgeting. And then during the 2000s, we were only talking about councils and conferences. During this shift, a lot of people said, and several researchers pointed out that, councils and conferences are not as radical democratic as participatory budgeting. They do not allow direct citizen participation, they do not empower, etc. But the thing is, they were not looking at what was actually happening. And as research develops, we see that these tools, they are obviously different, and they are less radical than participatory budgeting, but they do provide a lot of political and social outcome, both for civil society organization and as well for policy. So, and now that we are losing both councils, we don't have any councils. And so in the last 2 years, councils have become wow, they're super radical, democratic and participatory, when they were not 20 years ago. So the thing is what are these standards? What are we looking at? And what are expectations about it? And I think the calibration Ryan provides in his book showed what are the standards that we are looking for. And I think Maggie also tackled that when we are going, when we study participatory budgeting in autocratic regimes, what are the standards or what are the expectations? They are not exactly the same as when we are looking at participatory budgeting in Europe. So I think those normative expectations might bias our understanding for potential outcomes and what to expect that PB should produce. So I think like we should look more at what is really happening, what is really going on, and what it is producing, despite our expectations that what it should produce or not.
Michele has asked in the chat. Michele, do you want to ask a question?
Oh, yeah, no, just listening to what Matt was saying, and Brian, I was just wondering if there was some example of where actually some a participatory budgeting process started by a government actually induced some, civil society movement where they actually initially they weren't. So like it was like a feeding back into the civil society, well, starting from the top though. It's something that happened. This was a question.
I can speak to the more like government mandated, and Mike and Brian might have something more to say about donor initiated, but there are some examples, but they are very few. Mostly the evidence is that the existing civil society organizations can be strengthened and we can see a multiplier effect, but I only know of very few cases where the organizations sort of organized and formed a consortium. That's definitely the exception though.
Yeah, I think in some other cases where maybe the World Bank or USAID, DFID, other multilateral institutions have provided funding for participatory budgeting, at least to create programs. It opens space for civil society, and civil society can form to occupy that space in some places. Now, there's anecdotal evidence that this is possible, but oftentimes what we see in these contexts is civil society organizations that already exist that collaborate as contractors or as allies with the existing governments move to occupy the space in participatory institutions, as opposed to brand new organizations that don't have those connections that then emerge to fill the space.
And I see your question. Could you elaborate on what you mean by that?
Well, I was thinking, I hadn't actually thought about top-down participatory budgeting and its potential to induce new or kickstart new civil society movements. I'm actually living in Wales. I'm a visiting research fellow at Southampton, and it's the sort of thing I could imagine happening in Wales, but I'm then wondering, would that actually be a desirable thing? I have reservations about participatory budgeting being focused on existing civil society alone. It's civil society organizations alone, because they themselves are not terribly democratic. Yeah, so I was just wondering about your views about whether it would be desirable, because I could imagine it might be achievable, at least in Wales.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. It seems to me that if a new government has sort of a project to broaden and deepen civil society state interaction, that might be a way in which a government-led program could really draw in lots of new actors. So you could imagine this as a reformist, democratic type of government. But if it's a government that is doing this because it makes them look democratic and participatory, or if because they're trying to sort of look good on some sort of scale, or if they're doing it to appease certain types of civil society organizations, I would imagine that would end up reinforcing the existing usual suspects. So those who are already linked to the government would benefit from it. So I think that this sort of goes back to Matt's point. It's really sort of figuring out sort of what the government motivations are to be doing this is a really key part of the process. Are they really trying to empower citizens, or are they trying to set up their next election campaign activity.
I just say quickly on that as well in response to what Anne was asking. I think one of the things that in the Global Perspectives book as well that's interesting about the model is that you talk about how all of these things can be seen as what we call an independent or dependent variable in various different analyses. And the question about building civil society is actually one that hasn't been asked enough. There's anecdotal evidence in the ethnographies about particularly what Stephanie was talking about, where you have the multiplier effects and you build up maybe a weaker civil society becomes a stronger one, which was what I was kind of getting at in those successful cases. It's not so much those donor organizations going into kind of places where you've had effectively no civil society and an authoritarian state for long periods, or obviously very weak civil society. I don't think there's any such thing as no civil society except for some places, but that is that to me that's an outstanding question that people should be answering. And if someone came into me and they said I want to do a PhD on that, I'd be very much looking to back them, because I think it's a really good research question about whether that really is possible.
If I can jump in on that question, when we were doing field work in Porto Alegre in 2006, 2008, participatory budgeting was already declining, but there was really a push from the city to support the organization at the neighborhood level of school before the elementary school. They were called creche, right? I don't know if you use the same name and it had become such a push that almost everybody was just proposing those. And to the point, it almost generated some clientelistic dynamic, right? And it was very interesting to observe. So I think the question of Anne is super interesting, because there is a potentially a very instrumental approach of stimulating a type of civil society that it's actually linked to you. And it links back to what Silk was doing, right? And it's a form of cooptation in the end, because those creches were actually not so legal anymore, because the national government had implemented a reform. And so there were rules on how to create a small school in your family. And if you just send an inspection, the school would disappear. So I think that question is super interesting. And there is enough probably anecdotal evidence if a person goes looking back at those case studies about that attempts. Maybe there is space for one last question, and then we should close because we are 30 minutes over time. I don't see any last questions, so I want to thank you, the authors, thank you, the amazing commenters, and the audience for their question. They were extremely, extremely stimulating. It was really a pleasure, and it was a really fun event. I hope to see you soon in person somewhere, and thank you very much for participating.
Yeah, thanks everyone. It's great.
Thanks, Paolo.
Yeah, thanks, Paolo. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Carla. Thanks, Maggie.
Yeah,
thank you all.
Lovely to see you all, and great question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks
You
so much.
all.